Hi, hello, welcome to lesson 8 of unit 3. We're going to talk about isolating variables and specifically using the quadratic formula to isolate that variable. So during this lesson, you're going to learn how to rearrange formulas to highlight a quantity of interest using the same reasoning as solving equations. Fancy way, you're going to solve x, you're going to try to isolate x by itself. And 2, we're going to use the quadratic formula to find the roots of a quadratic. Alright, let's get started. Alright, isolating variables. So there's times in equations where we want to get a certain term or a certain variable by itself. We use the same method as before of when we're just doing like a one-step or a multi-step equation. And that's what we're going to do. Sometimes we want to do that when we have like a quadratic, and we're going to talk about how we can solve that. So here's an example. Isolate a variable. We want to solve for t. Okay, so that means I want to get t all by itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, what is t doing currently? Well, what's stopping t from being by itself? It's this r. What is r? What math operation is r already performing to t, where r is being multiplied by t? So to move it to the other side, I have to do the opposite of what's already happening, which is division. So I'm going to divide both sides by r. Those r's cancel out, and I get d divided by r equals t. Simple. Okay? That's all we're doing. Now I want you to try. Solve the following for q. Alright, so I want to get q by itself. I have this a and this h that are stopping it from being by itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move from the outside in. In this case, that h is the first thing, the furthest thing away from the q that's stopping it. So I'm going to subtract h from both sides. What I get is I get q divided by a. Those h's cancel out, equals b minus h. Then I have this a that's stopping q from being by itself. So I'm going to multiply both sides by a. And I get, let's see, those a's cancel out. So I get q equals a multiplied by b minus h. There we go. There's my answer. Alright, so the quadratic formula. So sometimes an equation can be difficult to factor. Okay, so last time we talked about completing the square to solve for it. And it's difficult to solve by completing the square. So there's the two things. So if it's difficult to factor and and completing the square is going to be difficult, we're going to use the quadratic formula. So there's my thing. The quadratic formula is always going to find the solution. So even if from the very beginning if something is factorable or you can complete the square, if you want to use the quadratic formula, you definitely can. It will always find the quadratic solutions. It will always find the quadratic solutions. So to find the components of the quadratic formula you find the quadratic formula from the standard equation. So I have my standard equation here. So notice I have my a, my b, and my c, and that's where they get plugged into in the quadratic formula in this equation. There's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay. So while using the quadratic formula, if you get a negative number underneath the radical, there's no solutions. So what that's saying is, if this part right here, if when you simplify it all and you get a negative number, there's no solution. Soon, in term 3, so I think that's going to be in unit 4, you guys will learn how to deal with negative numbers underneath radicals. Alright. So let's just talk about setting up the quadratic formula. To set up the quadratic formula, I need to identify my a, my b, and my c. And you guys should have practice with this because we have learned how to factor using this a, b, and c. So I'm going to look through my equation. I have my a. Where's my b? There's supposed to be the number in front of this x term. Remember, if there's nothing there, it's a 1. And then my c. So a is 5, b is -1, and c is a 1. So if I set up this quadratic, I have a negative b, so -1, plus or minus the square root of b squared. Make sure that you put this -1 in parentheses. It's going to be really important if you put it in the calculator, that the calculator understands that you're squaring a -1. Minus 4 times my a value times my c value, all divided by 2 times a. So notice, my a's are right here. Oh, I didn't even 2a. There we go. So I have my a's right there. My b's in the equation is -b here, b there, and then my c goes right there. Okay, so we're looking for all that. That's just the setup. We'll talk about solving it in the next example. So I want you to try. Just set up the quadratic equation. Okay. All right. So I have a, I have b, and I have c. My a is right there. We get a 5. My b is right here. We get 6. C is right there at a 1. Okay, so now we're going to plug this into the quadratic formula. I have -b, so -b plus or minus. Remember, this is equal to x. I should say that. This is x equals -6 plus or minus square root of b squared, so 6 squared, minus 4 times my a value, which is 5, times my c value, which is 1, all divided by 2 times a, which is 5. There's my setup. Not too crazy complicated. We're just plugging stuff into the equation. Alright, let's now talk about how we're going to solve using the quadratic formula. So when we do this, we're looking for those solutions, right? So we're trying to find those x-intercepts. So what I have to do first, my first step, is I need to set y equal to 0. So I have 0 equals 2x squared minus 5x minus 11. Okay. The next step I have to do is I have to identify my a, my b, and my c. A, b, c. So a is right there. There's my 2. B is right there. My -5. And c is right there at my -11. Okay, so I have my a, my b, and my c. My third step here is I want to insert these into my quadratic equation. So I have a -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. Okay. Once I have that, then we can start simplifying underneath the radical. So we're going to start simplifying all this stuff very first. So so let's start with that. So I'm going to just start from left to right. I'm going to go -5. We can get rid of those parentheses now. Go plus or minus the square root Alright, so let's start with negative 5 squared. Negative 5 squared would give me 25. Minus, fix that, minus 4 times 2 gives me a negative 8 times negative 11. All divided by 2a, which is 4. Okay, we still have to finish simplifying underneath the radical. I have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25. Negative 8 times negative 11 gives me a positive 88, all divided by 4. Next step. We still need to add that 25 plus 88 underneath my radical. Negative 5 plus or minus, let's see, 25 plus 88. Let's do that real quick. We get 13 here, and we get the plus or minus the square root of 113 over 4. Remember, this all equals x, because that's what we're going to be solving for. So x equals, alright, there's your answer. So the only next step we would have is if we could simplify underneath here, we would. Right now I cannot. And there's your answer. So if we were to write this as a coordinate point, I would write it as negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 113, all divided by 4, comma 0. Alright, I want you to try this now. So I'm going to pause the video, work it out, and then look for the video for the solution. Alright, so step 1, we're going to set y equal to 0. We get 4x squared plus 8x plus 7. Next, I want you to identify your a, your b, and your c of the equation. So we know that a is 4, b is 8, and c is 7. Next, I want you to plug it into the quadratic formula. So I get negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. So 2 times a is 4. Okay. The next step is we want to start simplifying my equation. So I have negative 8, we can get rid of the parentheses right there, plus or minus the square root of 8 squared, we can say is 64. Negative 4 times a positive 4 is a negative 16 times 7, all divided by 2 times 4, which is 8. Okay. Step 5. We have negative 8 plus or minus, get that equal sign there, the square root of 64. Let's see what 16 times 7 is. 7 times 6 is 42. Then we get 112 minus 112, all divided by 2 times a, which is 8. Okay, step 6. I'd say negative 8 plus or minus. So let's see, we want to go 112 minus 64 here. We know this is going to be negative. Let's see, 10. So we get plus or minus the square root of negative 48 all over 8. Okay, so I want you to notice something here. Notice that underneath this radical, you have a negative number. We don't know how to deal with that yet, so what that tells me is there is no solution. When I get this no solution, what's happening is that I have either a quadratic that is above the x-axis that's not going to cross, or one that's below it facing downwards. It's never going to cross the y-intercept. All right, if you have any questions, please come and see me, and have a great day. Thanks.